on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Mike Konczal. He's got a piece in the New Democracy Journal. We'll put a link to it at majority.fm. It's entitled The Voluntarism Fantasy. Welcome to the program, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
I love this piece because I have literally had this argument with maybe not hundreds, but certainly tens of libertarians who have called into the show. And I'm saying well into the tens, the double digits, close to triple digits maybe, about this concept of it's a dual concept. One is that there was a time where we didn't need this government interference, and the other part of that argument is that we don't need it again in terms of taking care of people. And you have a great piece. And let me just start with, conservatives tell themselves a story, a fairy tale, really. What is that fairy tale, Mike?
So as you described, it's a story about the idea that before the New Deal, and particularly in the 19th century, before the progressive era, we took care of poverty through civil society, through, communities coming together, through people looking out for each other, often in voluntary societies. And we were able to combat poverty, we were able to combat poverty in old age, we were able to combat health insurance and unemployment and the other things that are the kind of big risks we have in our society. And second is that the New Deal and the Great Society are kind of, they're the kind of anomalies in that if we got rid of them, we could return to that society where small communities and local communities could take care of one another again. And so it means that we could, and crucially what it means is if we do things like cut spending, if we cut food stamps, we cut Social Security, it may be painful for a very short period, but essentially we together would come together in kind of voluntary groups and take care of each other. And I think that's really problematic.
Yeah. Well, let's start with, and by the end, I want to get into, sort of what is the foundation of why they tell themselves this fantasy. But before we get there, let's look at this empirically. Was this the case? I mean, was the 1890s and the early, I guess, 20th century just a period of when people would charity would make up for this, and there was no poor people really, unless they just wanted to be poor, I guess.
Exactly. So it's interesting. There's a lot of reasons why a lot of people tend to emphasize the idea that there was no state or there was no public or there was no government in the 19th century, because, one is I think a lot of people really want to emphasize that the New Deal was a big break, so they really want to especially like liberals want to do that, and a lot of libertarians want to kind of have this golden compass that they can return to at any point in time, but that has just never been the case. The state has always played a role between poorhouses, between essentially local requirements that churches take care of people who are homeless or otherwise in deep poverty, to, like the government's role in dealing with floods and other kinds of insurance policies, the government's role in expanding the West and building out this public infrastructure, government's role in businesses and corporate licenses and bankruptcy codes that allow businesses to have a kind of risk insurance and social insurance as well. The government has really deep roots. And when you go after the Civil War, it's even deeper because you have Civil War pensions that were kind of a precursor to Social Security. And so you have a really deep government. So the idea that there was ever this kind of laissez-faire system is totally a lie, and it's wrong as just a historical matter. We walk through the history of that. What was true is that there was laissez-faire in the sense that the courts would always strike down worker protections and strike down unions and strike down minimum wage and hour laws, and that was consistent until the New Deal. So, but there was always the role of the state in structuring markets and structuring the way we deal with social insurance. The thing is, those systems tend to be very pro-corporate, and they also, with things like poorhouses, tended to be very demeaning and very difficult for people who were experiencing poverty, especially in old age.
All right, so let's talk about a little bit of that of the social insurance system that existed, prior to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Let's talk about this idea of things like business risk management and Let's start with that. I mean, what does that mean, and how did it play a role back in those the late 1800s, early 1900s that libertarians in particular seem to pine for?
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at things like a corporate charter, which is, a very much a government construction. I mean, it was created at the state level and expanded out out of the Northeast, and it allows things for, like, if you're a shareholder of a company and the company goes bankrupt, you don't get thrown in debtor's prison, right? You're not on the hook for those losses in the way that people were back in the day, or back in, earlier than the 19th century, which meant that in practice you could suddenly get a lot of capital raised to build businesses that could stretch across the country. I mean, you could invest in things like railroads or shipping companies, or things that are going to be much larger than a local business. So, the actual scale and crucially the industrialization of the United States went in tandem with ways that the government created legal structures to help, share risks among businesses. Now, it was only a matter of time before that same kind of logic would be extended to workers around the New Deal and to everyone with the Great Society.
But I think that point, I want to really hammer this point, because that is a form. I mean, things like bankruptcy, things like liability kept at arm's length, is a form of insurance that then is leveraged by people in the same way that I can take risks maybe with, in my life, because I know that Social Security is there, and at the very least, I won't be destitute on the street. But this is a social insurance for businesses.
Absolutely. Like most forms of insurance, it limits the worst case scenario, right? So if you are trying to save money during your life, but you can't do it, or you make a bad investment, Social Security makes sure you have a basic minimum in old age. Same thing with shareholders, that even if you invest in a company and it goes terribly wrong, your losses are limited. You will only lose what you invested. You're not on the hook for this extra stuff that's very difficult for you to manage. So, if you invested in, pets.com, that maybe have been a terrible decision, but you're not going to owe bondholders all this money. But if you invested in, General Electric, it may have been a very good deal. So, the government's always had a very crucial role in building out our country. And that's, not to be, the whole "you didn't build that thing," is relevant here. I mean, there's always been a partnership, and the industrialization, the real economic might of the way the country was built up during the 19th century was always joined at the hip with the state.
All right, so let's talk about, more sort of, I guess, obvious social insurance systems that took place, or existed during that era. You mentioned that churches were actually, I guess, forced in some way or coerced by the state to provide some relief for people. Right.
So, so when you talk, it's interesting because some people have accused me of attacking a straw man in this piece, but I don't think I have, because you talk to enough people, and if you particularly talk to enough libertarians, this is always animating their discussions. The idea that, we had this voluntary system that worked so well, and it was only in the government's coercion is like really ruined things or, made things much worse. What I wanted to point out, first of all, is that the old system that existed was really spotty. And it was nowhere near up to the needs of an industrializing society. I mean, when you had things where people were really dependent on the business cycle, when people were really dependent on employers who did not have deep relationships with them, if you had, the kind of modern society of, industrialization and worker capitalism, suddenly it's really hard to, have money saved up for old age. It's really, people's bodies were being destroyed all the time through industrialization. So disability was a really big concern. And if you're not able to work, or if you're disabled, or if you're older, then you're suddenly in a lot of trouble. And so when you actually look at these old societies, really what the big benefit they provided was funeral benefits, because people were really worried about suddenly dying and leaving their family with a really big financial burden to be buried and have a proper funeral. And so like, but when you actually look at the old age pensions at the time that were privately given, the equivalent of the 401k of their day, like the 401k of our days, like it was not sufficient to meet the needs of people in old age. So you had other state facilities like poorhouses, which were deeply humiliating for the people in them, and there's no even presumption of dignity in old age for people who had to live in these places that were designed to be punitive to keep people out of them. And so, like, the old system was really brutal, and the system that arose, and crucially, and then the Great Depression just basically bulldozed it, and we can talk a little bit about that. But, by the time when the Great Depression forced a lot of people into need, all those systems collapsed, which led to the New Deal that we had, and we still have today for now.
Yeah, all right. So that's the point, is that there was in existence sort of like very spotty, state mandated, literally state governments in some instances, or state government established, and some federal government programs after the Civil War. We saw some of those programs, and then as much suffering was still going on at that point, and sort of just, I guess, there was just not the political ability to address that suffering. I mean, back on the Bowery in the early 1900s, you had something like 20 to 30,000 people literally living on the street of the Bowery at that time. And then essentially we have the Great Depression, and it functions like a tsunami. It washes away these structures, and talk about why they specifically couldn't deal with it. I mean, the notion that charity would then, or what we perceive as charity or charitable outlets would then rise to the occasion, is exactly the opposite of what happens.
Yeah, there's a great book called Making a New Deal, which really walks through this. And you have, especially during the 1920s, you have a lot of immigrant communities, especially in the big cities, that have built up these private charitable organizations. And you're talking about things like private banks, private lending facilities, private insurance, essentially forms of wage insurance. So if you were unemployed for a week or two, you'd get a little bit of money and then you'd kind of pay it back later. The Great Depression did a couple things very quickly. One is that it just increased the demand for wage support, or for, everyone was in a lot of trouble, and it was the equivalent of people needing unemployment insurance or food stamps. And so, there was a huge demand for it. And exactly at the same time, this is the second punch, that people were tightening their spending, right? We see this in our recession as well, is people were afraid to donate, afraid to put money out there because they themselves are worried about their standing. So, there's a huge demand, and then the supply also contracts on the charities. And the third really big part is that the normal way, especially when you have a new wage earning force, that people deal with uncertainty is just, putting more hours on the workforce, but you couldn't do that when unemployment was 10, 15, 20, 25%, as it was during the Great Depression. So it was designed, the system was very fragile. It did not have the deep penetration it needed to really stabilize spending or really stabilize the welfare of the country. And secondarily, it did not have the deep pockets necessary to survive through this kind of things. So you saw these things collapse one after the other. And workers at that time saw this and said, we're proud people. We don't want to, we actually are, there's a lot of reasons for this, but they suddenly turned to the idea that, the state can actually do this well. And it can do this in a way that's not totalitarian. It's not going to be intrusive. It's not going to be bad for people. It's just that we're going to have an insurance system that's run through the federal government that will take care of things like unemployment, disability, and old age. Ideally at the time they should have taken care of healthcare as well, but they did not. And that system has worked, and it's worked incredibly well. And I walk through how it's worked really well in the Great Recession, because we've also seen a decline in charitable giving during the Great Recession, the last 5 years, in a way where food stamps and unemployment insurance went out immediately and helped save the economy.
Yeah. Now, those in particular are called automatic stabilizers. Just talk about. Just tell us what that means and how they function and how they ebb and flow based upon just basically need, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So a nice thing. So when the housing bubble collapsed, a lot of people got very nervous and stopped spending so much. Corporations stopped investing. And then we saw the Great Recession really dive. And the Federal Reserve was put in check on what it could do to try to boost the economy, especially in the short term. And so what you saw was that there was a big fall in spending. However, because people became unemployed, because people became poor, the government automatically kicked out money to increase spending. So you saw food stamps go up. It's been a big controversial debate. You saw unemployment insurance go out as people lost their jobs. They got their income stabilized through unemployment insurance. People pay into these things through their taxes, through indirectly through state taxes. The crucial thing, one of the nice things about automatic stabilizers, they automatically go up this is the automatic part, when demand is weak, when people are suffering, and then they automatically come back down as the economy recovers. In fact, we're already starting to see food stamps and unemployment insurance go down independent of the cuts that are brutal and unnecessary. The logical endpoint of that is very useful, right? Because it kicks in demand. It kicks in people, allowing people to spend to boost the economy exactly at the times that we need it.
And just so that people conceptually, understand this, it's not that the amounts go up. It is that the number of people who are eligible increases, not because of any change in eligibility, but simply because people essentially fall into the realm of eligibility.
Yeah, and it's crucial. And the thing is, just to say one more time clearer on my end, it goes up when the economy is starting to weaken, and it goes up automatically when the economy is starting to weaken. Charitable giving, what we saw in the Great Recession, has actually declined as the economy was going into collapse. And it declined even as a percentage of the economy. And when people went out and asked people, because there's a whole industry that watches charitable giving in the country, it was simply because people were fearful about their budget. They were worried about money in their pocket, so they gave less. And that's exactly when you don't need that to happen. So there's a lot, I walk through kind of a theory of why charitable giving is a bad substitute for a proper social insurance state. And there's issues about, the penetration of it and how broad the coverage is. But it's also this issue of when things get bad, the government can step up in a way no other entity can. If we were reliant, automatic stabilizers went up about 2%, 3% of GDP at the beginning of the Great Recession, which is equivalent to all charitable giving in the country. And crucially, all charitable giving a lot of it goes to Harvard, a lot of it goes to your favorite opera hall to get, your favorite rich person's name on it. Only a little bit of it actually goes to income security as we understand.
That's what,
so,
you break down three different type of voluntary failures. One is that philanthropic insufficiency. I guess this is, based on a study that Lester Solomon did. One is the insufficiency, which you've covered. And then the particularism is this notion of, when people are giving charity, in some respects, there's the big money goes to, building a wing at Lincoln Center or, I guess a new laboratory at Harvard. It doesn't necessarily address what the problems are.
Yeah, there's a big thing about how I think one of the largest charitable donations is just given to Harvard, which if you actually look at its bank account, it's like a hedge fund with the university attached to it. And it has a huge money. And it's exactly what you would not donate to try to make sure people were able to keep a roof over their head or had food on their plates. And so, yeah, if we want a welfare state to ensure dignity for people who are in poverty, for people who are in old age and can't work, the private charities it's designed not to do those kinds of things. It's designed to allow people with the money to kind of pick and choose what they want to support. And they're going to pick and choose a lot of things that kind of, build up cultural capital among other elites, or that they particularly want to stigmatize other kinds of populations, which is exactly what we don't want to be doing.
All right, so let's broaden this out a little bit because, I think anybody who thinks that you're arguing or creating a straw man has not been paying attention, I think, to at least a large sector, it seems to me, of what is animating younger people in the Republican Party. A, and then B, the underpinnings of things that like Paul Ryan go out and talk about. This is at least what I use this term loosely, the intellectual underpinnings of what they're arguing. But why? I mean, it seems fairly easy to go back and look at the sort of the empirical reality about this. Why do you think this story is told? I mean, because on one level, the argument you're making is that is twofold. One is that we never lived at a time where there was no state intervention in social insurance, very broadly speaking, and two, that when it was minimal, it was not up to the task. And why we have today, what we have today, it seems to me like that argument is made less based on sort of like, or I should say, the counter argument is made less based upon data and more on wishful thinking to justify essentially a worldview that libertarians have.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, I see three broad trends. One is that people on the right want lower taxes on the rich and less money going through the government, full stop. So when you actually look at how the government spends its money, it spends a lot of it on health care and old age pensions through Social Security and income support for poor people. And, if you need to cut money, that's where you're going to cut it, and especially if you want to, conversely, lower taxes. The second is, I think a lot of people on the right, in different versions of the statement, have a real allergy to the public and to democracy and to the idea that we're in this together and we're going to ensure a baseline of support for people when they're vulnerable. They would prefer to see things go through private hands, things to go through markets or for-profit institutions. The classic one is private accounts for Social Security. George W. Bush would have actually ran a much larger deficit in Social Security, for all the deficit hawk allergy stuff about Social Security. They would have blown a huge hole solely for the purpose of running it through Wall Street and solely through the purposes of putting all that risk on each individual, because I think that very ideological vision of how risk emboldens people or enlivens people or, makes them existentially at risk or something, where, I think security is much more important for liberals and for regular people when they're actually asked about these things. And then, the third is, I think, there's a kind of nostalgic and romanticism to a lot of conservative thought. I think, Corey Robin wrote a book called Reactionary Mind that's really good on this. For all the talk about, sober, bougie kind of, button-down conservatives, there's a real kind of reactionary nostalgia for old times when men were men and things were better, that animates a lot of this, and that can kind of drive this kind of 19th century conquerors, frontiersman society that doesn't exist anymore.
I want to also touch on, you quoted President Truman in I guess it was a 1946 radio address, in his definition of charity, because I think, at the end of the day, I think this is where the perspectives on what the function of society is supposed to be about, because I don't think that, the arguments that voluntarism is a more efficient way of providing for the poor or for society's needs, those who need it the most, it just seems to be founded upon nothing. Like you say, it's a fantasy. I think at the end of the day, it is just a way of a justification of it really isn't our responsibility. So what happens, happens. And Truman had a different definition of charity that was more encompassing, I think, than the one that we hear, I think, in general used today, but certainly on the right. Just touch briefly on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing, this thing's obviously a critique of the right, but it's also a nudge to liberals as well, for a couple reasons. And two big ones is, one is that, there's often a tension being seen between civil society and our private lives and our community, and then the state, which is this kind of bureaucracy in a tall building far away. When it's, you can actually, it's very clear, and it was very clear at the time of the Great Depression, that they're intertwined and that they can bolster each other. So, when you're looking at the Great Depression, you have a lot of charitable organizations, a lot of civic community groups, churches who are saying, we don't have the resources or the infrastructure to actually deal with the mass economic insecurity that comes with an industrial and now post-industrial society. We can't provide everyone an old age pension. That's the proper role of the state. We can do much more targeted and much more useful things about, say drug addiction or say counseling, or we are much more nimble creatures where these huge burdens, these huge kind of almost atlas-like structures of having to hold up the real, hold up people against economic risk is the proper role of the state. And by allowing the state to do these things, we can treat each other much more as equals and actually target problems as a community and as civil society that's much easier. And the second thing is I think liberals, and we're going to make some tough choices in the next decade about whether or not we need to lean more privately or publicly on things. I mean, the retirement crisis and Social Security is the most obvious place on this. And I think there's always been, especially in the last couple of decades, and you see in things like Bowling Alone, and liberals tend to really romanticize some of this stuff, and they seem to be much more uncomfortable with the public than where they need to be right now. And we need to really get liberals to re-examine this and really refound themselves in the idea that by doing stuff like increasing Social Security, we're not robbing civil society. We're actually allowing it to be much more richer and more complete by completing this project.
Well, what do you make of that argument that, if we didn't have taxes, then there'd be a lot more money for charity?
Well, there'd be some, but the charity would go in it wouldn't do the things we want social insurance to do. So, I mean, you'd see a lot more, people would bid up the name that goes on the fancy opera in New York or whatnot, or bid up the names that go on the dorms at Harvard. There would be some, and then the other thing is that it would be spotty. It'd be bad coverage. It would be, in certain areas and not in other areas. It'd hit certain people and not other people. And the big thing is it wouldn't be consistent. It would kind of come and go with the whims of people who have the money to donate. And that's not what we need social insurance to do. We need that is the opposite of economic security, which in turn leads to an economic really kind of freedom.
Well, Mike, I love the piece, the Voluntarism Fantasy. It is at the New Democracy Journal. We got a link to it at majority.fm. Really appreciate your taking the time to come and talk to us about it.